It does matter how you meet someone, and it does matter how you treat them when you first meet them. And it's amazing. I've learned to do this, at least in part, partly because I'm a clinical psychologist. I've learned how to talk to people very rapidly. And I have the most amazing adventures with people in cabs and when I travel, because I'll talk to them directly right away. And they'll tell me the wildest stories and show me the craziest things because I'm actually interested in what they have to say. And I'm not afraid. Well, I'm somewhat afraid, but I'm not sufficiently afraid to have that stop me. And I'm acting on the presupposition that the person has something of great interest to reveal. And that's a very useful thing to know too, because one of the things that's really cool about people, and you really learn this as a clinical psychologist, is that if you can get people talking, they're so damn interesting you can hardly stand it. You know, because they have these idiosyncratic experiences that are only theirs, right? They're only theirs personally. No one else could tell the story. And that's the kind of stories that you want to hear. And when they tell you those stories, you learn something you didn't know. And so what that means is that you can treat the landscape of strangers as an endless vista of places to learn things you didn't know. And if you know enough so that you're satisfied with your life and everything has ceased to be a tragedy around you, well then you can be comfortable in your circumscribed domain of totalitarian knowledge, let's say. But if your life is insufficient and you're suffering more than you want to and everything isn't what it should be, then you need to look where you haven't looked for what you don't have. And then you can look outside, beyond you, and then you can make friends with what you don't understand. And that's a huge part of what this story is about. Because what happens is that Abraham welcomes the men, God, angels, and treats them very well, and reaps a tremendous benefit as a consequence. And then, well, then the story reverses, and we end up in Sodom and Gomorrah, where the same angels sojourn, and they're treated terribly, and all hell breaks loose. And so that's what the story's about. It's fundamental. Now there's a sexual impropriety thing going on that I'm also going to delve into, but I don't think that's the critical issue in the story. The critical issue in the story is, how do you act in the face of the stranger? You know, there's a statement in the New Testament. Christ says something like, when you do something to the least of people, you do it to me, him, right? And that's a very difficult statement to understand too, but it's something like, it's something reminiscent of the requirement to keep the idea of the transcendent reality of the person in mind at the same time you keep their proximal reality in mind. To have your mind in two places at the same time when you're talking to people. You know, I learned from a friend of mine in Montreal who is very socially sophisticated in some ways. Whenever he went into I always liked going shopping with him. And whenever he went into a store and he talked and he had an interaction with a clerk, the first thing he would do is have an interaction with the clerk. You know, he wouldn't have an interaction with the role of the clerk. He'd like look at the person, sort of take stock of the fact that they were there, and then ask them something genuine about their job or their store or how they were doing, like go into a conversation right away. And he didn't get personal about it because that can be intrusive, right? You have to be very sophisticated to do this. But he did indicate to the person that he was there, at least in part, for the good that could be done between them. It's something like that. And then the person would be ridiculously helpful. And so then, you know, if people mistreat you, you see this with antisocial kids. It's a very tragic thing to see, because if you're an antisocial child, by the time you're about 4, you're very hostile and distrustful to people. And so you're like a growling puppy. And if you're a growling puppy, you tend not to get petted. You're more likely to get kicked. And if you're a growling puppy and you get kicked, then you have even more reason to growl. And that's sort of the story of antisocial kids. If they're not well socialized by the time they're 4, and they're more on the aggressive side, then they alienate themselves from the community, and all they get is rejection. Well, and then they look at the rejection and they think, well, to hell with humanity, you know? And no wonder they think that. But the part of the catastrophe is that they get what they evoke. And I'm not saying it's their fault precisely, but it doesn't matter. That's still what happens. And so you might ask yourself, if you're not getting from people what you need, there is some possibility that you're not approaching, especially if this happens to you repeatedly across people. and this is a virtual certainty, if it happens to you repeatedly across people, especially if you have the same bad experience with people, it's not them, it's you. I would say 3 is the limit. If something happens to you once, you write it off. If it happens to you twice, it's like you open your eyes, but you write it off. But if it happens to you 3 times, it's probably you. Or it's the rest of the world. Better it's you, because you're not going to change the rest of the world. Well, so what happens with Abraham? Well, he's at home, and these angels show up. Now, we don't know whether they're angels or men precisely, because, well, as this part of the story reads, as the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he's another visionary state by all appearances. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. There's real ambivalence in the story about the men. Are there 3 men? Are there 3 angels? Are there 2 angels and God? It's all mixed up in the story. So we won't clarify that. We'll leave it ambiguous. And I think the ambiguity is important because you don't know who the stranger is when you encounter him. And it depends on whether you're thinking about it in the normative manner or if you're thinking about it in the transcendent manner. Because with each person that you meet, well, they're just a person. That's one way of thinking about it. And then they're the person that you know, or they're the person as they choose to reveal themselves to you, and people keep themselves shielded. But then they're also something of great metaphysical potential, right? And you might say, well, do you believe that? And I would say, well, yes, you believe it because you expect a lot from people, generally speaking, and are not happy if they betray you. But more importantly, our entire culture is predicated on the idea that each person has an indefinite intrinsic worth. And I'm not talking about self-esteem. I'm talking about something like the, what would you say it? The implicit presupposition in our legal structure that no matter who you are, even if you're a murderer, even if you're a condemned murderer, that there's something about you that's of transcendent value that has to be respected by the law and by other people, right? And so that's a remark. And you might say, well, you know, do I believe that? And the answer to that is, well, you act it out because you follow the law. And it's not an easy thing to pull out of the law. It's kind of the idea that you have intrinsic natural rights. And you don't pull that out of our law, man, without having the whole thing fall down. And I think the whole idea that you have intrinsic natural rights is predicated on something like the biblical hypothesis that human beings have a logos nature and that we are involved in the speaking forth of being. And as beings who are involved in the speaking forth of being, there's something about us that has to be respected by ourselves in relationship to ourselves, by ourselves in relationship to other people, but even more strangely, by ourselves in relationship to even to criminals, even to vicious criminals. You can't remove that transcendent element. And that to me, that's also a miracle of conceptualization, because who the hell's going to think that up, right? Even the most vicious of murderers has a touch of the transcendent that needs to be respected. Of all the ideas that are unlikely, that's got to top the list. And of course, without that, you have a very barbaric legal system, right? Because no one is protected. As soon as you make a mistake, then you're in the damned and you have no rights whatsoever. And that isn't what happens in the West, which is an absolutely amazing thing. So anyways, Abraham is a master of the stranger. That's one way of thinking about it. He knows what to do when strangers come along, and he opens himself up to them. And I would say he does that. We know he's not a naive guy, Abraham, right? He's no weakling. A couple of stories ago, he took a big army and, went and harassed a bunch of kings and took his nephew back. He's a tough guy. And so if strangers show up and he welcomes them, it's not because he couldn't do otherwise. He could certainly do otherwise. And it's not because he isn't aware of what people can be like. He's perfectly aware of what people can be like, but he determines to take a particular attitude towards them, and that is to welcome them. And why would you do that? And I think the answer to that is you hold out your hand in trust to someone and you evoke the best from them if that's there to be given. So it's an act of courage. It's like, it isn't me meeting you exactly. Not exactly. It's more like the transcendent part of me making a gesture that allows the transcendent part of you to step forward. And that happens all the time. It happens all the time in normative discourse. You know this perfectly well, because sometimes you can have a real casual conversation with someone that just goes nowhere, right? It's just shallow as can be. Or now and then you can actually make contact with someone, right? And you're both, I would say, enlightened and ennobled by the conversation. And that's we would call that a deep conversation for some reason, because we made a deep connection. Whatever that means. It means, well, it certainly means that it's not shallow. We're not sure about what these metaphors means, but it means that it reaches deep inside of you. It's something like that. You make direct person-to-person contact. And those sorts of conversations are replenishing. That's the right way to think about it. They genuinely are. And I think that's because they provide you with that bread that's not material bread. And that's the information that you need to thrive and to put yourself together.